Have you ever been so infatuated with somebody else that you felt intoxicated, that even just being with them gave you an enormous natural high? If so, then probably there was a bit of a dark side as well. Intrusive thoughts, mood swings, involuntary, uncontrollable obsession. If so, you have probably experienced limerence, a particularly powerful form of obsessive love that feels like you're addicted to another person. In this video, I'm going to break down what limerence is and what it isn't, and explain what's going on in our brains during that kind of period of wild infatuation. So if you've ever wondered why and how somebody can be so impossibly attractive that you become obsessed with them and they overtake your mind, keep watching. Hi, my name's Tom Bellamy. I'm an academic neuroscientist and writer, and I blog all about limerence at the site livingwithlimerence.com. Over there, there's over 400 articles about every aspect of limerence and how to manage it, and a thriving community of people who leave comments and share their own experiences of dealing with obsessive love. But what is limerence? So it's not a term that you hear very commonly. Is it a real thing, or is it just a buzzword? Well, there's actually more than one way to answer the question, and that's what this video is all about, so let's dive into it. Okay, so a good place to start is with the original definition of limerence. So limerence as a concept and a word had a very specific inventor, Professor Dorothy Tennov, who was a US psychologist working in the 1970s. Professor Tennov was interviewing people that were going through the early stages of love, and particularly those that were suffering with kind of romantic distress or romantic heartache. And she was trying to come up, as a behavioral psychologist, with a sort of set of symptoms that would define that altered mental state of being in love. So she came up with the term limerence to define that mental state. And as a word, it's just entirely invented. She just thought it sounded good. Particularly, she wanted a word that sounded good in French. And so limerence was the term that she adopted. So she summarized her work in a book, Love and Limerence, that was first published in 1979 and then revised in 1999 with a jacket endorsement from Simone de Beauvoir, just to prove its credentials. And in that book, she came up with a list of around about 20 symptoms that defined limerence. So these were things like having frequent intrusive thoughts about the person that you were infatuated with. And in fact, Tennov came up with the term limerent object to describe the person that the limerent was infatuated with. And she chose that term very deliberately to try and capture the fact that limerents tend to idealize and idolize their limerent objects. So they don't treat them as rounded people. They kind of project a romantic fantasy, their own romantic needs onto this other person. Okay, so back to the symptoms. Other examples are things like an exaggerated dependency of your mood on the limerent object's actions. So things like elation when sensing reciprocation, devastation when sensing disinterest. Another one would be fleeting relief from unrequited feelings through vivid fantasy about reciprocation of romantic affection by the limerent object. So limerents tend to daydream very intensively about their limerent object. An aching sensation in the heart when uncertainty is strong, and so on. So as I say, there's a list of around about 20 symptoms. If you want to see the full list and check whether you yourself have ever experienced the symptoms of limerence, there is a quiz on my site at livingwithlimerence.com. Are you a limerent? I've linked it down below so you can see for yourself. Okay, so a common reaction to seeing that list of symptoms for the first time is many people will say, well, that's just a crush, or that's just love. You don't need a special word for defining that. But one of the key insights that Tennov had was that not everybody experiences that total emotional, psychological overwhelm during the early stages of love. And actually, Tennov had this breakthrough on a long-haul plane flight from Paris, where she'd actually been interviewing Simone de Beauvoir, back to New York. And she was with her friend Helen Payne and talking about her research. So she was going through the symptoms of limerence and talking about this. And she realized over time that her friend Helen was becoming increasingly irritable and impatient. And it turned out that Helen had never experienced that suite of emotions, that list of symptoms that Tenoff was describing. And in fact, she had found that in her life, limerence had mostly been a problem because other partners, potential romantic partners of hers, were experiencing those kinds of emotional overwhelm. And that was a problem for her because she wasn't experiencing the same thing. And in fact, Helen Payne saw this more as a form of kind of neurotic or immature love that derailed promising relationships before they really got started, when this other person became obsessed with her and became infatuated, wanted increasing closeness and increasing kind of immersion. And so that breakthrough was when Dorothy Tenoff realized that actually limerence is not a universal human experience, that only a certain number of people experience limerence in their lives. Tenoff definitely conceived of limerence as an altered state of mind, and really it's sort of a new mental mode that you can fall into, that you're operating in when you're deeply infatuated. And it's a sort of mental state that completely dominates life. It's all-encompassing. So to quote Tenoff in her later research, she said, "Limerence is an either-or matter. Either the algorithm is operative or it is not." So in other words, you're either in that distinct mental state or you're not, and you're in the mental state of ordinary life. But what's it like? What does it feel like to be in this mental state of limerence? Well, obviously Tenoff took an entire book to summarize her insights into the phenomenon. But I think rather than pages and pages of dry academic analysis, sometimes just people expressing it, personal testimony of people going through limerence can be more powerful. So here's some quotes from people who have been to the Living with Limerence site and left messages that I think summarize the experience of being limerence in a very clear way. "The highs are so high, but there is always a crash, always pain afterwards. I just want to feel normal again, but I can't untangle myself. It's like my world has been in grey my whole life, and now suddenly it's in colour. I feel this crazy mixture of shame, euphoria, humiliation, bliss, guilt, anxiety, loss, yearning. I feel like I'm going crazy. I want it to stop, and I don't want it to stop. When she's around, I don't know how to behave nor what to say. It's a mixture of uncertainty, fear of rejection, and joy from feeling she's in the same room. Oh my, it's killing me almost. I'm just obsessed. I can't turn the thoughts off. I can't escape from the downs, and I keep chasing the highs, even though I know I always crash after. I just want her more than anything I've ever wanted before. Everything about her is perfect." So I think those quotes capture that idea of love intoxication in the early stages of limerence. And actually, intoxication is a very good way of describing it, also from the perspective of neuroscience. Tenoff was working at the level of human behavior, but I'm a neuroscientist. And when faced with a phenomenon like an altered state of mind, love intoxication, I obviously look at it from the perspective of what's going on in the brain. So from that neuroscience perspective, there's really three key systems that we have to think about that can explain the symptoms of limerence. So the first is the reward system. So this is the euphoria, the exhilaration, the highs, the emotional highs of limerence. So the reward system also is what drives desire and craving, and that makes you motivated to try and seek more contact with your limerent object. The second neural system that has to be considered is the arousal system. So this is the kind of intense energy, the exhilaration, but also the anxiety and the fear of loss associated with limerence. So that's a whole body experience, the racing heart, sweaty palms, dilated pupils, the full arousal response. The third neural system that we have to keep in mind is the bonding system. So most limerence report an intense sense of connection to their limerent object, a specialness of the intimacy with them. There's some special romantic potency about this other person that they feel very powerfully drawn to. And that desire to bond and connect with another person, that really is being driven by the bonding system in the brain, which is where sort of the hormones of love come into play. So we do have these neural systems that need to be understood, that underlie the neuroscience of the experience of limerence, but also looked at from the perspective of the behavior of limerence. Another important insight is that limerence behave a lot like addicts. So limerence can be understood, I think, very powerfully as addiction, a behavioral addiction, specifically addiction to another person. So when it begins, limerence feels fantastic, literally like an intoxicant. But of course, intoxicants can be addictive. If the limerence can be satisfied, so if you can actually form a healthy, natural relationship with your limerent object, then you can experience that mutual bliss and the ecstatic union described by Simone de Beauvoir. But life being what it is, often we can't actually form a healthy, natural relationship with our limerent object. If there are barriers in the way, or if there is uncertainty, or if the limerence is unrequited, then it can progress. And in fact, it can kind of turn sour and become much closer to an addiction. So you start to experience things like mood swings and cravings and intrusive thoughts. And also limerence at this stage tend to become a bit more deceitful in their behavior. So they tend to keep their limerence obsession secret, maybe tell lies, maybe start adopting behaviors that are more like an addict. Essentially, this other person is kind of like love heroin, and limerence start to act like a junkie. Okay, they want that high, but they're ashamed of their habit, so they keep it secret. So from the perspective of neuroscience, we can understand the systems that drive limerence, and we can kind of conceptualize it as an addiction. But why would we have this addictive vulnerability built into our brains? Well, whenever it comes to romance, inevitably you've got to start thinking that reproduction is going to be a major factor, a major motive force in behavior. And really, limerence is a supercharged drive to form a pair bond with your limerent object. Now, humans are unusual amongst mammals, even amongst primates, in using social monogamy and pair bonding as a reproductive strategy. And there's lots of theories as to why humans behave in this way, and why we're unusual in that way. But broadly, pair bonding is very beneficial because it provides what's known as fitness interdependence. So this is the mutual benefit of forming a bond that allows a man and a woman to conceive a child, and then for that child to be born. And within the pair bond, both are committed to providing the resources and security and safety for each other and for the child through that most vulnerable early period of life. So limerence can be thought of as an intense pair bond, and that is very beneficial from an evolutionary perspective. So it does make sense that some of us would have this mechanism for forming a pair bond built into our brain. Okay, so I've been through what limerence is, but what about what limerence isn't? So the first thing limerence is not is a recognized mental health disorder. So you will not find limerence listed in any of the authoritative texts. It's not in the DSM. It's not in the World Health Organization guidelines. So if you talk to a psychiatrist, they wouldn't recognize limerence as a defined condition. The second thing that limerence is not is stalking. So whenever we're talking about obsessive love, obviously stalking is likely to come up. But limerence is driven by this intense desire to form a bond. It's driven by reward. It's that experience of euphoria and the desire, an intense desire for another person. Stalking is really quite different. it's driven by anger, by resentments, by the desire to try and hurt the other person and cause fear in them. And really, stalking most commonly is about a jilted partner who is trying to somehow get revenge on the person that they feel has wronged them. In other cases, stalking can be a consequence of a disorder known as erotomania, which is delusional. So this is the belief that another person has a sort of secret love connection with the delusional person that's suffering from erotomania. And so then that person will be stalking their love object in the delusional belief that there is some special connection between them. So really, from a neuroscience and a psychological perspective, limerence and stalking are really quite distinct phenomena. The third thing that limerence is not is a attachment disorder. So limerence is very often talked about from the perspective of attachment theory, and it is a very important part of the story. There is a strong correlation between limerence and anxious attachment. So through my site, through Living with Limerence, I actually carried out a survey to try and assess how common limerence is in the general population. And in that survey, I asked about attachment style. And what we found was that in people who have a secure or avoidant attachment style, about 50% of those people have experienced limerence. But for the people who have an anxious attachment style, 79% of the respondents had experienced limerence at some point in their life. So there is clearly a strong correlation between limerence and anxious attachment, but anxious attachment is not required to experience limerence. Plenty of people without an anxious attachment style have experienced that altered state of mind. The fourth thing that limerence is not is a sign that something must be wrong with any existing relationship. So limerence is most disruptive in life if you have a primary relationship but become limerent for somebody new. And clearly, a way to try and make sense of that experience is to think, well, I can't be in love with one person but then become infatuated with somebody else, so there must be something wrong in the primary relationship. Actually, that's a kind of a category error. Limerence is always only the early stage of love. So limerence can last for a long time, unfortunately under the wrong conditions, but any limerent experience is ultimately going to burn out. Hopefully it will transition into a kind of longer term, more stable form of love, a kind of affectional bonding. But that long-term love is always going to feel different from the kind of fireworks of the early experience of limerence. So the fact that you can become limerent for somebody new isn't in and of itself evidence that something must be wrong in your primary relationship. Now, often limerence is a wake-up call that something is wrong in your life, that for some reason escape into a new romantic adventure seems like a very appealing prospect. But just the fact that you have experienced limerence for somebody new doesn't necessarily mean that there is a serious problem with your existing relationship. Okay, and finally, as I've already mentioned, limerence is not just love or just a crush. So from that survey on my site, around about 40 to 50% of people in the general population have never experienced limerence. So it isn't a part of their experience of love. They have all of the kind of excitement and joy and romantic energy without falling into that state of intense, profound romantic infatuation. So it is the case that there really are kind of two tribes out there of people that experience early love in different ways, the limerence and the non-limerence. And in fact, the failure to recognize that and the failure to see that those two tribes will have profoundly different expectations about the way that love should feel and about the way that relationships should progress is the cause, I suspect, of an awful lot of heartache and an awful lot of misunderstandings in romantic relationships. Okay, so I've made a lot of claims in this video about what limerence is and isn't, and I'm going to be working through the evidence for that, for those claims in future videos. So subscribe if you want to follow along, or pop over to livingwithlimerence.com for more information and lively discussion. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.